So you've bought a new camera and you don't really know how to adjust all the settings and you don't really know what the settings actually do. Well, in this video we're going to talk about one of those settings that you may not understand, ISO. I'm going to try not to be too technical, I'm going to try to really simplify things for you, and this is going to be your crash course. So let's start off. What is ISO exactly? ISO is your camera's sensitivity to light. When you have a lower ISO, your sensor is less sensitive to light, it'll produce a darker image. When you have a higher ISO, your sensor will be much more sensitive to light and it'll produce a much brighter image. However, this light is what you can call artificial. It makes your sensor a little more sensitive each step up you go, from 100, 200, 400, 800, 1600, 3200, 6400, etc., etc. Now, when your camera sensor does this and becomes more and more sensitive to light, your photos will get what's called noise. And you'll see on photos that were taken with a very high ISO that they can be very grainy, very noisy, and a lot of the detail may be lost. There are times that you need to raise your ISO and there are times that you need to lower your ISO, so we're going to go over those right now. So option 1. You're outdoors, you're shooting a portrait shot. You have your subject in front of you, it's a sunny day, there's daylight, maybe a little cloud cover, but the lighting is good, and you want to make sure that you have the sharpest photo possible. The best setting that you could use is anything between ISO 100 and ISO 400. The reason being is you don't need to compensate with all the natural light around you when you're outside. Another reason why you want to use lower ISO is because it'll produce a sharper image. Now, if you were to raise your ISO when you're in that really bright light outside, your image would get brighter. You'd be able to use a smaller aperture and you'd be able to use a higher shutter speed. However, if you already have the natural light there, you don't need to artificially raise it with ISO. Again, the goal here is to keep your ISO as low as possible. But that's not to say that you can never raise your ISO. There are plenty of situations that call for a higher ISO and the images come out perfectly fine. For example, say you're shooting sports, you're at a basketball game. The gymnasium is lit, it has lights all over the place, but it's still not bright enough for photography, at least not for the photography that you want. You're going to want to be using a really high shutter speed because there's a lot of action going on. You want to capture all those moments and freeze time with a high shutter speed. But if you're using a high shutter speed, less light is going to be hitting the sensor because the shutter speed is so fast, so the images are going to be darker. Even if you were to have a wide aperture lens that could gather in a lot of light, you're still going to have to bump up that ISO quite a bit. And this is where you're going to have to use things like ISO 1600, ISO 3200, and it'll still look like a really good image. Even with that little bit of extra added noise, because of your higher ISO, the fact that you're shooting at the higher shutter speed and the image is properly exposed in the first place will make up for the fact that you were shooting in low light. Most modern cameras today will be able to handle up to ISO 3200. Anything past ISO 3200 gets a little too grainy and is really for specific uses of your camera. However, that being said, you could still make it work. So let's recap real quick. A lower ISO is a darker image. A higher ISO is a brighter image, but you should never be using ISO alone just to brighten or darken your image. ISO should probably be your last resort for wanting to make your image brighter. You should already be going through your shutter speed and your aperture before you even arrive at changing your ISO. A lower ISO will give you the best detail. A higher ISO will give you a little noise and a little grain, which isn't always a bad thing, especially when you need it in those low light situations. So don't be afraid to raise your ISO a little higher when you need it. Don't take a shot that's really dark and really underexposed that you hope to bring up later in Lightroom and you'll say, I'll just raise the exposure later. It doesn't always work like that. You're going to lose detail. So I hope this was concise enough for you to understand how ISO works just a little bit better. I'm going to be releasing future videos on aperture and shutter speed and a video on how all three of these things work together to properly expose your images. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments. Really appreciate you guys watching this video. I do want to thank GrizzTuff for sending me some of this gear I'm wearing here in the video today. They are not sponsoring this video, but they were kind enough to send me this stuff and I just want to show it off. If you want to check them out, they're going to be in the description below for their Instagram page. Also, my Instagram page with all of my wildlife photography is @dom.iwc. That will be in the information below. On all the photos that I post, I always put up my shutter speed, aperture, ISO settings, my lens settings, and my camera settings. That way other people can look at my photos and kind of learn from my experiences just by reading them straight for themselves at their own pace. Otherwise, thanks very much for stopping by, and I will see you on the next one.